On today's episode, I'll get into whether the Blackhawks missed out on Patrik Laine and yet another Jonathan Toews sighting.
You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
How we doing, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just a quick reminder off the top to hit that like button, comment down below, and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks if you're watching on YouTube right now. I'm currently on the climb to 2,000 subscribers. Would really like to hit that number before the Blackhawks get things underway in training camp next month. So please help me out. Won't cost you anything to subscribe to the channel. If you're tuning in through an audio platform, be sure to rate and review the podcast as well, preferably with a 5-star rating. Those are always greatly appreciated. And last but certainly not least, got to let you all know, today's episode is sponsored by FanDuel. Go and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon right now to download America's #1 sportsbook. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. I hope everyone's Wednesday is off to a phenomenal start. Patrik Laine has officially been dealt by the Columbus Blue Jackets. Some of you may remember I had an episode come out earlier on in the summer when the rumblings of not only Laine's return from the player assistance program, but also him officially requesting a trade from the Columbus Blue Jackets in seek of a fresh start first surfaced. I shared my thoughts on the matter there and whether the Blackhawks should kick the tires on the former second overall pick back in the 2016 NHL draft. For those of you who don't remember that episode or my feelings on the matter, despite Laine having his share of off-ice issues last year and quite really off-ice drama surrounding him since a smashing first 3 NHL seasons with the Winnipeg Jets. He's only played in 18 games last year, tallying a career low 9 points, 6 goals, and 3 assists. I'm aware of all of that, but despite this, I thought the Blackhawks should make a run, or at the very least, general manager Kyle Davidson should be kicking the tires, seeing what the asking price would be for a player of Patrik Laine's caliber for a couple of different reasons. One being that the upside is undeniable. And while I know it's been a while since we've seen Laine at that peak level, right? I mean, the last time he scored 40 goals was the 2018-19 campaign, which was his third year in the NHL. Even though the numbers haven't been at that level, if you go and look at him, this guy is still a pretty consistent 20 goal scorer and even mostly into the upper 20s in that category. And what I think is something that people don't really keep in mind when thinking about Patrik Laine, yeah, the lack of production or the numbers taking a dip, at least in comparison to what they were early on in his career, is absolutely disappointing. At the same point in time, he's expressed how the last handful of years, really, he hasn't been in the right state of mind. He hasn't exactly been happy with his situation where he's at. And he's kind of felt like, and even admitted that, it's hard to play at the top of your game when you're not really loving where you're at, what you're doing, or just in the right mental state. He's been very open about that. And despite all of that, Patrik Laine has still been at a point per game pace or pretty darn close to it these last handful of years. And he has one of the best shots in the entire NHL. Not many guys can shoot the puck like he can. 6'5", can play with pretty good pace. I just think the upside, even though it's been a while since we've seen it, is absolutely undeniable. And I know there's a little bit of a risk also, considering he's a bit of a one-trick pony. He doesn't really provide you with all that much offensively, and there's the off-ice stuff too, and the effort level can be in question and sometimes. I'm aware of all of that, right? And that's the risk behind going after Patrik Laine. But I think the upside is still locked in there somewhere in him. We saw it at such a young age, and I do believe he can get back to that level. And the second reason why I believe the Blackhawks should have made a run for Patrik Laine is because he only has 2 years left on his current deal, albeit at $8.7 million. That's a price tag you don't bat an eye at. I mean, that's big numbers that you have to keep into perspective there. But considering where the Blackhawks are going to be at for that 2-year stretch. And also, Connor Bedard is still going to be on his entry-level contract for those 2 years. Yes, it does murk up the Blackhawks books a little bit, especially after they went and had that bonanza July 1st signing day. I think had they have gone and made a deal before, maybe dishing out over $2 million to players like Patrick Maroon or Craig Smith, then it might have been a little bit more feasible. But even then, $8.7 million, if things didn't work out for Patrik Laine, wouldn't have been the end of the world for the Blackhawks, because while, yes, they're trying to get better and take a step in the right direction these next couple of seasons, they're not going to be Stanley Cup contenders, certainly this year and very likely next year either. So it's not going to fully restrict them. It's not going to be a huge disservice to this organization if they wound up being wrong on Patrik Laine. And if they were right, there's so much upside there. To me, just the risk was well worth the reward. I mean, think about Patrik Laine finding his game in Chicago and potentially playing on the top line with Connor Bedard, or playing on the same power play unit. Those two right-handed shots playing together would surely get a lot of defense's attention. So just the risk would be worth the reward because of the position the Blackhawks are in, because they could afford Patrik Laine financially. Bedard is still going to be on his entry-level deal for both of those 2 years, and the Blackhawks need to get better offensively. They've really struggled at putting the puck in the back of the net for the last handful of years now, and I liked the moves that they made in the forward department this offseason. They're certainly going to be better than they were offensively, but they still kind of lack that game breaker type option along with Connor Bedard. And while it's risky, admittedly, that Patrik Laine will ever get back to that level, we know if he finds the best of his game, boy, he can be one of the top talents and one of the best goal scorers in the entire NHL. So that's why I thought the Blackhawks should have made a run at Patrik Laine. But with the news, of course, of him being traded to the Montreal Canadiens, who are having themselves a heck of an offseason on Monday, we now know that's obviously no longer in the cards. The Blue Jackets sent Laine and a 2026 second-round pick to the Montreal Canadiens in exchange for defenseman Jordan Harris, who's a 24-year-old former third-round pick back in 2018 for Montreal. Could be a decent fourth, fifth, or sixth defenseman at the NHL level. More than likely, though, a bottom pairing guy. He was a stud during his college days with Northeastern. He's had a decent start to his NHL career. He's played in 131 games for the Canadiens over the last 3 years, most recently tallying 3 goals and 11 assists for 14 points in 56 games worth of action this past season. But from a Canadiens perspective, considering the defenseman prospects they have, and some of those guys are starting to arrive on the pro scene, quite honestly, they had a little bit of a logjam there on the back end. And with Harris making $1.4 million this upcoming season, the most out of kind of their fringe defensemen, that made him the most expendable there. The interesting kind of nuance in this deal, though, is that the Canadiens, or the Blue Jackets, are not having to retain any salary in order to move Patrik Laine, who, as I mentioned, has 2 years left at $8.7 million, a pretty hefty price tag for a guy who hasn't lived up to the expectations after his first couple of years in the NHL. And apparently, according to reports, the Canadiens were the only team willing to do that, to take on the entire $8.7 million over these next 2 years. So maybe, that's where Kyle Davidson kind of was thrown off a little bit. He didn't want to pay Patrik Laine that full $8.7 million. But I do think he, at the very least, made some calls to Columbus to see what was going down, because I really think, for all the reasons I just outlined, maybe Davidson wasn't as high on Laine or taking that risk as I am, but I do think, for the reasons that I just outlined, he would fit in this organization with the place that they're in right here, right now. And I think this wound up being a pretty good buy low spot for the Canadiens. They get a second round pick in 2026 to take on this $8.7 million contract. They only have to give up Jordan Harris, who they didn't consider in the upper echelon of their defenseman prospects. They clear some room, they get a little bit of money, and also it's a good spot for Patrik Laine to to find his game once again. Although I will say Montreal is probably not going to be very patient with him. They're going to have some high expectations there. If they weren't named the Montreal Canadiens and didn't have the Canadian market in that media pressure and fan base, I think this would be a really good spot for Patrik Laine. Not a lot of risk, though, for them, considering where they're at as a franchise right here, right now as well. They need to get better on the offensive side of things. They don't really have Stanley Cup aspirations these next 2 years, but they have a good prospect pool, and it's time for them to start getting better. So there are some comparisons to where the Blackhawks and the Montreal Canadiens are at. But ultimately, what that gets me to is, did the Blackhawks miss out on Patrik Laine? I personally thought this would have been a really good buy low opportunity for the Blackhawks. Maybe, Kyle Davidson didn't want to give him the full 8.7 million, but it still wouldn't have cost the Blackhawks a top prospect. They could have afforded Laine for 2 years, especially, like I said, if they had nabbed him before July 1st, and maybe if they did, they don't go and spend that extra money on a Craig Smith and a Patrick Maroon. That saves them an extra near $2.5 million. I would have liked to seen the Blackhawks make a move like this. However, one thing I will throw out there, maybe Patrik Laine had the Blackhawks on his 10-team no-trade list. That's certainly in the realm of possibility as well that we wouldn't know about. I personally doubt it, considering the Blackhawks, I know they've been at the bottom for a while, but it feels like with the talent they've accumulated in their prospect pool, and of course having Connor Bedard, they're looking on the up. And I wouldn't think, especially being an original six franchise, they're known for treating players, be careful with me saying that, they're known as being an organization that has first-class amenities for players, is what I'll say there in that situation. A really good fan base, the United Center, right? I doubt that the Blackhawks were on his 10-team no-trade list, but it's certainly in the realm of possibilities. Ultimately, though, only time will tell if the Blackhawks missed out on Patrik Laine. We'll see how it goes for him in Montreal. I know it would have been risky, but I honestly would have liked to see the Blackhawks have pulled off this move. But let me know in the comment section whether you think the Blackhawks missed out on Patrik Laine, whether you thought he was a risk worth taking, or whether you're happy that the Blackhawks and GM Katie ultimately wound up passing on the 2016 second overall pick. But there are my 2 cents on the matter. We're going to take a quick break, but coming up in just a moment, I'll react to the Blues snatching Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway from the Edmonton Oilers. But first, I got to talk to you all about the fine folks over at FanDuel. You've all heard about FanDuel at this point now, right? Of course, but we have something new, something a little bit different for all of you right here, right now, through September 22nd. All FanDuel customers can bet $5 and you'll get a free 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. You won't be just stuck with the Chicago Bears, which actually, for the first time in a while, fingers crossed, knock on wood, doesn't look like it's going to be the worst thing in the entire world. But all you need is a Google account and a current form of payment. And you can also cancel at any time, anywhere, whenever you want. And by the way, folks, I am still waiting, keeping my peepers peeled for those Frank Nazar Calder winner lines coming out on FanDuel. Really keeping a sharp eye out for that one. I know it's a long shot, but Frank the Tank's my boy. And if you want to tail me on Frank Nazar to win the Calder in 2025, all you got to do is go and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Again, just a reminder to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube. Thank you very much. And also, make sure to go and check out the new Locked On Sports Today, because Locked On's launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On. Plus, we got our national shows that cover every single league. So make sure to go and check out Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and to subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Segment 2, while most teams have settled down now here at this point in the summer and have at least figured out their rosters at this point in the offseason, the same cannot be said for the Edmonton Oilers. They have been all over the place recently. Not only by naming Stan Bowman as their new general manager, which, by the way, he had his first Zoom video presser that was posted on social media since being announced as the Oilers GM yesterday. And it's just still weird to see him in a position of power. I honestly cannot believe, and if it was going to be anyone, it was going to be the Edmonton Oilers, because clearly they don't care about morals or doing the right thing based on a lot of moves that they've made in recent years. Still can't believe that he's in that position again, not only for all the Kyle Beach stuff, but just for how incompetent of a job he's done as general manager. I mean, he made some decent trades for the Blackhawks, getting Antoine Vermette, but he also made some absolutely disastrous ones that crumbled this organization. And whenever the deals seemingly involved big name players, I'll give Stan Bowman credit. He made a lot of minor one for one small moves that, didn't catch headlines, but wound up working in the Blackhawks' favor, and made a lot of good small ads. But whenever it came to a premier or a prestigious player, Stan Bowman absolutely butchered those. Really weird to see him as the head honcho once again. And quite honestly, as I put on social media, his last few years have not treated Stan Bowman very well. He has not aged like a fine wine, in my opinion. No disrespect, Stan, but just my honest thoughts on that matter. But not only did the Edmonton Oilers name Stan Bowman their general manager recently, but they've also been figuring out some financial issues of their own, and they've been trying to squeeze around some money, make some roster moves in order to make things work and to get cap compliant. And that's led to a series of moves over the last couple of days. We saw them acquire Vasily Podkolzin from the Vancouver Canucks on Sunday. They also shipped out Cody Ceci to the San Jose Sharks, and then throw another crazy wrinkle into their offseason. A rare offer sheet sighting was spotted last week. The St. Louis Blues placed offer sheets down on Oilers young forward Dylan Holloway and defenseman Philip Broberg, both of them first-round selections in the last handful of years for Edmonton. Broberg was selected 8th overall, and that was actually, those were only the 9th and 10th offer sheets that we've seen in nearly the last 20 years of the NHL. Since 2006, there have only been 10 offer sheets. So they're a rarity. A lot of general managers don't like to throw them around because they don't want to get in bad graces or cause sour relationships with other general managers. It's a rarity today in the NHL, but we got 2 in one offseason, which is a double whammy there, which forced the Edmonton Oilers' hands. They had 1 week to ultimately come to a decision and match the offer sheets placed by the Blues. We found out yesterday that Stan Bowman elected not to do so, making Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway now both officially members of the St. Louis Blues, while the Oilers receive a second and a third round selection as compensation. But yeah, a real tough decision for the Edmonton Oilers, kind of in between a rock and a hard place type of decision here. Both players were, players that they had high hopes for, and we're going to be taking on larger roles for this team next year, right? And for Broberg, finally got to see the upside that got selected him in the top 10 in the Stanley Cup playoffs for the Oilers. By the time they reached the Stanley Cup final, he was playing much greater minutes on that pairing with Darnell Nurse. He actually surmounted Cody Ceci's spot. Cody Ceci had largely been playing with Darnell Nurse since being acquired by the Edmonton Oilers. By the time Edmonton got in the final with the Florida Panthers, they had moved Philip Broberg up to that pairing, and again, really just finally showed his upside for the first time. I think that gave Edmonton and their fans a little bit of a second opportunity, or a second opinion at least, on Philip Broberg and his future, because considering all the good players that were in that draft, all the lookbacks, Edmonton had to be kicking themselves a little bit with that one. And then for Dylan Holloway, even though the production really hadn't been there, and if you go and look at the numbers, they're not going to jump off the page or anything, he is a player who can make an impact in many different ways all over the ice, has good speed, some pretty solid size, works hard on the defensive side of things, a capable young offensive player who's still only 22 years old and doesn't really get a whole heck of a lot of power play time with the big guns on the Oilers. And again, only 22 years old, and it seemed like he was just starting to really find his stride at the NHL level. So I'm sure Edmonton did not want to wind up letting these guys pass, but ultimately just because of their financial situation, they bring back Corey Perry this offseason. They also go and sign Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson. They were just financially in a little bit of a bind and didn't really have any other options. Ultimately, by losing Dylan Holloway, that's a tough one because he's a solid, good young player. But with their forward group, they're going to be fine, right? They brought in Skinner, they brought in Arvidsson, they still have McJesus, Draisaitl, Hyman, right? Like the big boys, they're going to be fine up front. Edmonton's going to be okay. Nugent Hopkins, like they're going to be good. Defensively, though, this is where the loss of Philip Broberg is going to sting for them. They do still have their big three defensemen, if you want to call them that. Mattias Ekholm, Evan Bouchard, and Darnell Nurse. I don't know if you can really throw him in a big three. But after that, their defensive depth really falls off a cliff. After that, it's Troy Stetcher, Brett Kulak, and Josh Brown. And this is a team that's trying to win a Stanley Cup. I don't know if that's necessarily the depth that you want on the back end when you're in that position. Yeah, you probably want more than that. And while we have, of course, seen the Blackhawks back in 2015 essentially win the Stanley Cup with only 4 defensemen, 3 of those guys are probably Hall of Famers. Well, Hjalmarsson isn't likely to get in. We'll see what happens with Brent Seabrook. I don't think you can compare Mattias Ekholm, Evan Bouchard, and Darnell Nurse to those 3. So, yeah, losing Philip Broberg, it's going to make the right side certainly more thin for the Oilers on the back end. But they didn't really have a choice in the matter here because of the price that the Blues gave those 2 guys. The Blues offered Broberg 2 years at a $4.5 million AAV for Philip Broberg, which, yeah, he had a good playoff, but he had kind of been a ghost the rest of his career up to that point. So that's certainly an overpay. And then they also offered 2 years at $2.2 million for Dylan Holloway. The Oilers just don't really have that money, but now the defense is certainly a concern for them. I mentioned, I think they're going to be fine up front, but they just couldn't match those price tags. Certainly the $4.5 million for Philip Broberg. I mean, yeah, that's definitely an overpay. These were expensive acquisitions by the St. Louis Blues money-wise. What I will say, though, is I'm sure they wouldn't have made these additions or given out these offer sheets if they weren't high on these players, still only 22 and 23 years old. And they were former high first-round selections, guys that were drafted both inside the top 20. Broberg was inside the top 10. And they gave up essentially a second and a third-round pick in order to get those 2 guys. So from that sense, it's good value. But what I will say is it's a hilarious move for the St. Louis Blues if you've been following what they've been up to the last handful of years, which has been in salary cap hell. Because after they won the Stanley Cup, what did they do? They dished out term. They dished out big money. And it's really put them in a bind. That's what's led to them really not being in contention whatsoever since winning the Stanley Cup. And I think this is a good opportunity for them to make their roster better, but they had to dish out some more money to do so, which has literally been the Achilles heel of the St. Louis Blues. This gives them more depth. It gives them better. Again, I'm sure they wouldn't have made these offer sheets a thing if they weren't high on these 2 guys. I just think it was incredibly hilarious that it was the Blues giving Philip Broberg this massive overpay. The Holiday contract, he probably deserves to be somewhere around $1.5 million. That one's not the end of the world, though. But yeah, the Edmonton Oilers just ultimately could not match that. And now, Philip Broberg, Dylan Holloway, officially members of the St. Louis Blues, meaning our Chicago Blackhawks are going to be seeing a heck of a lot more of them over those next couple of years. But those are my thoughts on the Blues, laying down the law with some offer sheets here in the midst of the offseason. Going to take another break here, Blackhawks fans, but coming up in just a moment, before I wrap things up, I'll get into yet another mini Jonathan Toews update. But first, I got to talk to you all about Indeed. We're driven by a search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, but match with Indeed. And if you need to hire, then you need Indeed, because Indeed is the best matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates in an instant. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. And one of the things I personally love about Indeed is that it makes hiring all in one place so simple and easy, because you can skip out on the countless job sites that ask unnecessary questions and demand unnecessary information, and still winds up leading you nowhere. Instead, go and join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talents in an instant. And listeners of this show, you'll get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockdown. Again, go and visit Indeed.com/lockdown right now to get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility. Need to hire? Then you need Indeed. Real quick, just wanted to say thank you again for making Locked On Blackhawks your very first listen here to start your day. Be sure to be on the lookout for a fun offseason rankings episode that's going to be coming out later this week. The Locked On NHL Network has been doing a ranking system following the NHL draft, following free agency, and some trades that have been going down, just to get an idea of kind of where everyone thinks these teams are shaking out in the standings, as we're, again, just about a month away from training camp opening up. And also, make sure to go and check out the new Locked On NHL podcast, where the season never ends, providing national expertise with a local perspective. You can go and find the link to Locked On NHL down in the description, or simply search on YouTube or wherever you may be listening to your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Segment 3, I anticipated a lot of people probably stuck around or skipped ahead, as you can always do down in the description. I have everything time coded, so if there's a certain segment that you want to listen to more so than others, you can always go and click down in the description if you're watching on YouTube, or even if you're tuning in through an audio platform. I have everything time coded in the description, so you can jump around to specific episodes. You don't gotta go through the trouble of scrolling every 15 seconds and listening to what I said. Nah, I do you a favor. I got you covered in the description. But I have a feeling a lot of people stuck around until segment 3 on today's episode, because fittingly enough, for segment 3, we got a third Jonathan Toews sighting here this summer. The first was in June. I actually brought this up on the show. Some of you may remember when Toews joined the Chris Chelios hockey camp down in Chicago to go and sign some autographs with some fans. And then in July, he was back in Chicago again at Yorktown Mall in Lombard, I believe it was, for a meet and greet and another autograph session. I saw some people posting some really cool pictures with Jonathan Toews on social media. And now we got a little bit of a life update from none other than the captain himself via his Instagram, as he posted some pictures of him surfboarding and wakeboarding and just seemingly enjoying life out on the water up in British Columbia, with the caption, quote, "Forgive my northern attitude." I know this isn't the most noteworthy news, but anytime we get a Jonathan Toews sighting, since it has kind of been such a rarity these last couple of years, I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't talk about it. My first reaction to this, immediate thoughts. First, it's just really great to see Jonathan Toews happy with a smile on his face, doing what he loves. I mean, most of the videos you see of Jonathan Toews, like even throughout his playing career, like when he wasn't on the ice, in the weight room, grinding, making himself better, playing hockey, what does he love to do? He loves to be out there on the water, wakeboarding, hitting the waves, hitting the sun, soaking it all up. Really seems to enjoy himself there, and, enjoying one of his favorite things. It's nice to see him express, how much he's enjoying that. It just seems like Jonathan Toews is really happy, and good to see him out and about in the city of Chicago as well. As I referenced, that's kind of been a rarity these last couple of years since he stepped away from the Blackhawks organization. And it's nice just to keep us Blackhawks fans in the know, because we all love to see Jonathan Toews. He'll always be remembered as the captain in our hearts. I think it was fitting enough that he posted this picture as the same day I was breaking down the top captains in Chicago Blackhawks franchise history, which, as a reminder, was the most recent episode that I dropped. You can easily go and find that on the Locked On Blackhawks YouTube channel to find out who I ranked as the top 5 captains in Blackhawks history. But yeah, fittingly on the same day, Jonathan Toews posted to Instagram to give us a little bit of a life update. Just good to see a smile on his face. Good to see him enjoying life, being healthy, all that stuff. My second thought is what we've seen from Jonathan Toews this summer sure looks like a guy who's done with hockey, despite not yet officially retiring. And actually, Blackhawks fans, I have on my phone and my notepad, I have a whole list of off-season episode topics that I wanted to get to. And one of them was, will we see Jonathan Toews in 2024, 2025? I figured there was going to be at least by this point now in the summer, right? Like I've mentioned a couple of times here, we're about a month away from training camp getting underway. Preseason isn't that far after. We heard that Jonathan Toews wasn't going to play last season. He was going to get his body right, maybe come back, even though that did seem far-fetched at the time. The following year, which would now be this upcoming season, I figured at some point there was going to be some sort of a sprinkle or maybe not a major news bomb, but some sort of breadcrumb from Toews leaning us one way or the other. And we really haven't gotten that. Instead, it's just kind of been his 3 sightings this summer that have been the breadcrumbs. And that trail leads me to believe that, yeah, I think Jonathan Toews is hanging it up. I mean, I just don't know really what more this guy has to prove. He's been a winner at all levels. And while I'm sure it is infuriating to him that the last real taste of winning a Stanley Cup was when he did win it in 2015, and the Blackhawks really never got close from that point in time. And there's that competitive fire that's always burned in his belly. That's what made Jonathan Toews Jonathan Toews. And I think that would be the only possibility of him coming back, that desire to get back to the top of the mountain once again. But just given the unpredictability with his health issues and just with it being such a day in and day out grind, you never really know in his situation what the next day is going to provide. I think those risks just aren't worth really the reward in Jonathan Toews' mind. And I feel like for Taser to come back, he has to be 100% fully committed and know that it's going to go well. And I just don't know if he has those guarantees at this point in time. And again, even though it's been a while since he's been on top of the mountain, he was on top of that bad boy for a long, long time, man. And just seeing the way he's kind of gone about things, yeah, I don't expect to see Jonathan Toews playing another NHL game. Blackhawks fans, as sad as that is, the question is, what is he waiting for? Why isn't he officially retired? Or maybe he's still holding out some hope. Maybe he still believes, like, if there is a time in the next year or whatever it may be that he feels like he's 100% healthy, he's kind of put that stuff to the past and can still fully go and give it a go and feel like he can help a team out there on the ice. Maybe that changes, and maybe he's holding out for that. I don't really know what the holdup would be. Maybe there's a special date that he has in mind or something that he has planned. But yeah, it is a little bit weird that we haven't gotten like an official word one way or the other on what Jonathan Toews is going to be doing for this upcoming season. Maybe he doesn't want to deal with the media involving all of it, and maybe his subtlety is his message. Maybe that we're just not getting the memo. But yeah, I wouldn't anticipate Jonathan Toews, considering what we've seen from him this summer, and that's fine. If he's enjoying life, if he's happy, do what makes you happy, Jonathan Toews. You made all of us Blackhawks and hockey fans proud for so long. You deserve to do whatever you think is best for you and whatever makes you happy. And that sure seems to be lake life and kind of reminiscing with Blackhawks fans. It's great that he still loves to give back and take time to sign autographs and take pictures because, again, even though it's been since 2015 since the Blackhawks sniffed a Stanley Cup run, those are memories that people are never going to forget. And Jonathan Toews is always going to be at the focal point of those memories. So, yeah, hopefully this will lead to more Jonathan Toews sightings in Chicago. Maybe even a trip down to the United Center for a Blackhawks game to see Connor Bedard and the fellas in the fall. Maybe when the Blackhawks take on the Red Wings or something and Patrik Laine comes to town. We'll see. But there are my thoughts on another Jonathan Toews sighting here in the offseason. That's going to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks. As always, thank you all again for joining me on the show. Be sure to go and follow Locked On Blackhawks for free right now, wherever you may be listening to your podcast, and to subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube. That way, you can get the latest episode as soon as it becomes available each and every day. If you want to check me out on X, you can find me at Jack Bushman 2. For my strictly Blackhawks account, you can find that at Talkin' Hockey. Until the next episode, everyone, enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays. I'll see you next time on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.